You're still trying. And the harder you try, the less appears. It's not a lack of effort. It's something structural, and some part of you already knows it. There's a question most people never ask. Not because they're afraid of the answer, but because they've never been still long enough to hear the silence that follows it. The question isn't what you want. It isn't how to get it. The question is, who is trying? Which internal structure, which layer of identity, which configuration of thought is running the process? Because if it's the same I that forces, that visualizes with urgency, that monitors whether it's working, then you're not creating from a neutral field. You're creating from a contracted identity. And a contracted identity doesn't produce coherence. Produces repetition. Think about it for a moment. Have you ever noticed that certain things arrived without you trying so hard? That some changes happened exactly when you stopped thinking about them? That specific results emerged from a state you can barely describe, because there was no tension, no surveillance, no I monitoring the process? That wasn't coincidence. That was coherence. And coherence is the mechanism almost nobody studies, because almost nobody recognizes that the problem isn't the technique. It's who is using the technique. Isadora was 34 years old and worked at an architecture firm on the 3rd floor of a building with no useful windows. She wasn't anxious by nature. She was methodical. She planned everything. She visualized goals with surgical precision. She had studied manifestation, behavioral neuroscience, guided meditation. One Tuesday afternoon, while waiting for her coffee to heat up, she placed both hands on the edge of the kitchen counter and simply stared at the wall. She thought about nothing. She didn't try. The coffee heated. She drank it. She walked back to her desk. And for the first time in months, she didn't feel the weight of what hadn't arrived yet. 3 weeks later, the project she had internally given up on was approved. She couldn't explain it, but Daniel would know why. The 0-point field is not a technique. It's not an advanced meditative state reserved for experienced practitioners. It's a structural condition of the mind, a point of absent active identity, where internal processing stops colliding with external reality. It's the moment when the I that wants temporarily dissolves, and what remains is simply presence. No direction, no agenda, no weight of what hasn't arrived yet. Quantum physics uses the term 0-point field to describe the lowest possible energy state of a system, the point where there is no oscillation, but where potential exists in its purest form. Daniel isn't using this concept as a spiritual metaphor. He's using it as a structural analogy, because the human mind works in a curiously parallel way. When it stops oscillating between what is and what should be, it reaches a point of internal organization that somehow begins to reorganize what is outside. Not through magic, through the absence of interference. And here is the paradox that most personal development approaches ignore entirely. The effort to manifest creates exactly the resistance that prevents manifestation. Not because the universe is ironic, but because effort carries with it the signature of lack, and lack is an instruction. When you force, you are essentially communicating that what you want doesn't exist yet, and the system responds to the instruction, not the intention. That is coherence. And coherence is brutal in its precision. If your mind is in a state of intense seeking, it emits the signal of seeking. If it's in a state of anxiety about results, it emits anxiety. If it's in a state of doubt disguised as faith, it emits the doubt, not the faith. The field doesn't read what you want. It reads what you are while wanting. And what you are while wanting most of the time is someone who doesn't have it yet, trying very hard to get it. That is the invisible mechanism, and it operates with the same neutrality as gravity. Now comes the part that requires real attention, because this is where almost everyone makes the same structural mistake. When people learn that effort blocks, they try not to effort. They try to relax. They try to let go. And in that trying to let go, there is a new effort now disguised as non-effort. The mind that monitors whether it's letting go enough is the same mind that monitored whether it was manifesting enough. The I simply switched strategies. Stayed in control. The 0 point is not reached by trying to reach the 0 point. That's a functional paradox, not a philosophical one. It means there's a structural difference between entering a state of absent identity and trying to enter that state. The difference isn't semantic. It's the difference between coherence and noise. So how does it happen? This is where the investigation becomes more precise and stranger. Most 0 point states that people experience happen not when they plan for them, but when they stop being entirely relevant to themselves. In the middle of a walk with no destination. In a moment of contemplating something mundane. A cup, a leaf, the sound of a distant engine. In the instant after crying without quite knowing why. In that pause between one thought and the next that sometimes lasts less than a second, but which, when noticed, seems to contain something that ordinary time doesn't. These moments are not spiritual. They are structural. They are moments when the identity that operates stops operating. And what happens in those instants, that strange expansion, that sensation of something having settled, is not illusion. It's the nervous system experiencing internal coherence. It's the 0 point field manifesting not as achievement, but as the absence of conflict. And the mechanism of creation functions precisely in that absence. Daniel first observed this in himself, then in patterns that repeated in people around him. Not the most disciplined people, not the most spiritualized. Those who arrived at a specific kind of exhaustion, not depression, not giving up, but an exhaustion of the I that manages. A moment when the identity that was trying simply had no more fuel to keep trying. And in that functional collapse of identity, something began to move. What moves doesn't come from outside. That needs to be clear. The 0 point field is not a transmitter that sends requests to the universe. It doesn't function like a spiritual antenna. It functions like a resonance chamber. When the mind stops colliding with itself, when the I that wants and the I that monitors and the I that doubts and the I that forces all fall silent simultaneously, what emerges is not emptiness. It's organization. It's as if the system, freed from the noise of identity, can finally operate according to its most efficient configuration. And efficient configurations produce coherent results. Not miraculous ones, coherent ones. The distinction matters. A miracle presupposes an exception to the law. Coherence presupposes fidelity to the law. The 0 point doesn't break rules. It operates according to deeper rules, those that only become accessible when the most superficial layer of the mind stops interfering. Now, what Daniel calls consciousness engineering begins here, in the precise mapping of which layers of identity are active during the creation process. Because it isn't enough to know that effort blocks. It's necessary to identify which forms of effort you practice without realizing, and some of them are extraordinarily sophisticated. There's the obvious effort, forced visualization, affirmations repeated with urgency, the daily checking of results. But there are forms of effort that disguise themselves as non-effort. Gratitude practiced as a technique. When you feel gratitude for a future achievement but underneath there is anxiety that it won't arrive, is not the absence of tension. It's tension with positive vocabulary. The field reads the tension. The acceptance that is actually strategic resignation, I accept it might not come as a way of appearing detached so that it will is also not the 0 point. It's sophisticated manipulation of reality, and reality isn't manipulable by sophistication, only by coherence. And coherence requires that the interior and the process be aligned, not performatively but structurally. Here's what that means in practice. It's not about feeling the right emotion. It's not about vibration, not about frequency in the popularized sense. It's about the degree of internal conflict present in the moment you exist in relation to something. If there is conflict between what is and what should be, between who you are now and who you need to become to deserve the result, there is noise. And noise doesn't collapse into creation. Collapses into more noise. The 0 point emerges when that conflict genuinely is not present, not suppressed, not ignored, not accepted as strategy, absent. And the only way to arrive at that genuine absence is through something few approaches mention with precision, the temporary dissolution of the identity that desires. That is not nihilism. It's not giving up. It's surgical precision applied to the structure of the I. Think. Who are you when you want nothing? Not as a spiritual exercise, as an honest investigation. Is there a you that exists before the list of goals, before the desires, before the identity built around what is still missing? That you, that presence without agenda, is the 0 point field. It's not emptiness. It's the substrate. It's the field. And when creation emerges from that field, not from the I that wants, but from the substrate that precedes the wanting, it doesn't carry the signature of lack. Carries the signature of coherence. And reality, which is essentially a system of responses, responds coherently. Daniel spent years investigating why certain people, apparently without special discipline, without elaborate technique, without performative spirituality, lived inside a flow that others couldn't access. And the pattern that emerged wasn't of people who had more faith, more willpower, more clarity about their goals. It was of people who had somehow intuitively or deliberately learned to exist with less chronic internal conflict. Not people without problems. People with less inner war about the problems. The difference wasn't in what they did. It was in what they were while doing it. This points to something neuroscience is also mapping through different paths. States of cardiac coherence, where the heart rate regularizes in a smooth, undulating pattern, correspond to states of cerebral organization, where the frontal and limbic lobes operate in synchrony rather than in conflict. In these states, decision-making improves, the perception of possibilities expands, creativity increases, not as a result of effort, but as a result of the absence of interference. The system works better when it isn't at war with itself. That is measurable. It is structural. It is replicable. And here is what that implies. The 0 point is not a mystical state reserved for moments of illumination. It is a physiological and cognitive state that can be recognized, cultivated, not forced but favored. The difference between forcing and favoring is the difference between all conventional personal development approaches and what Daniel calls consciousness engineering. Favoring the 0 point means creating internal conditions that reduce conflict, not by resolving every problem, not by eliminating every fear, but by learning to exist with greater neutrality in relation to them. It's the difference between a river that was violently redirected and a river that found its natural course because obstacles were gently removed. The natural course of consciousness, when it isn't at war with what is coherence. And coherence, as Daniel has observed repeatedly, is the most precise creation mechanism that exists. Now, a question that always arises at this point: if the 0 point is the absence of identity, how do you maintain intention? If I dissolve the I that wants, what guides the process? That's the right question. And the answer completely reorganizes how you understand the relationship between intention and effort. Intention does not require tension. That is the core of everything. Intention can exist clear, directed, precise, without the emotional weight of urgency, without the vigilance of the one who monitors, without the identity that defines itself by the result. A clean intention is a direction without attachment to the path. It's knowing where the river flows without needing to push the water. Most people conflate intention with effort because they learned that wanting something deeply means trying hard for it. But wanting deeply and trying hard are structurally different things. You can have an absolutely clear intention about something, and exist within that intention so naturally that it creates no conflict, generates no urgency, produces none of the contraction that characterizes effort. That is intention born from the 0 point. It doesn't push. It orients. And what is oriented from the 0 point encounters less resistance. Not because reality became easier, but because you stopped creating most of the resistance you were meeting. Because the resistance, for the most part, wasn't out there. It was in the collision between what you are and what you think you need to become. It was in the constant judgment of the distance between the present and the desired future. It was in the identity that built itself around absence, and that, paradoxically, needed to maintain that absence in order to keep existing. That is the most subtle and most crucial mechanism of all. There is a layer of identity that organizes itself around what hasn't arrived yet, that defines itself through seeking, through struggle, through the process of trying. And that identity, functionally, has an interest in the result not arriving because if it did, identity would need to reorganize. It would need to stop being the one who is seeking and become the one who arrived. And that transition for identity is a kind of death. It's not conscious self-sabotage. It's the physics of identity. Systems tend to maintain their configuration. An identity is a system. The 0 point in this context is not merely the absence of tension. It's the temporary collapse of that identity that seeks. It's the moment when the I that doesn't have it yet stops existing as a reference point. And in that collapse, the internal system stops operating according to the logic of lack, and can finally operate according to the logic of coherence. That's when reality begins to respond differently. Not because you did something different, because you stopped being the one who was in the way. Daniel wants to make this absolutely clear. It's not about technique. It's not about the 5 steps, the 7 habits, the 3 affirmations. Techniques are useful for those who already have internal coherence, and practically useless for those who don't, because incoherence simply digests the technique and uses it to produce more incoherence, now with the appearance of method. The real work precedes technique. It exists at the level of identity. It's in the precise recognition of which internal structures are active, which are generating noise, which need to be dissolved, not fought, not suppressed, not replaced by positive affirmations, but genuinely dismantled through lucid observation. Lucid observation is different from anxious introspection. Anxious introspection asks, "What is wrong with me?" with the urgency of someone who needs to fix it. Lucid observation asks, "What is happening here?" with the neutrality of someone investigating. And in that neutrality, the mechanism reveals itself, not as moral failure, not as irresolvable trauma, but as a pattern of processing that can be recognized and, recognized with sufficient precision, begins to reorganize. Because the mind has a remarkable property. What is observed without judgment tends to reorganize. Not always in the direction the observer expects, but always in the direction of greater coherence. As if clean observation were itself an organizing agent. That isn't mysticism. It's the functioning of the nervous system, Attention alters what is observed, not metaphorically but neurally. What receives clean, sustained attention reorganizes. And the identity that creates noise, when observed with precision and without the judgment that feeds it, begins to lose density. It loses density. It doesn't disappear at once. It doesn't collapse dramatically. It gradually loses the solidity that seemed absolute, until, at a certain moment, you notice you're no longer operating from it. Not because you made a heroic decision to change, but because it simply lost the force your own judgment had been giving it. And in that space where identity has lost density, something quieter emerges. Not as dramatic revelation, as an obvious perception you somehow never noticed before. Like recognizing that the light in the room was always on. You were just too occupied looking at the shadows. That is the zero-point field. Not the place you arrive at after enormous work. The place that was always there, beneath the noise. Now, what Daniel has observed repeatedly is that this field is not neutral in the sense of inactive. It is neutral in the sense of non-polarized. It isn't pulling toward the past or pushing toward the future. It isn't loaded with the weight of what was missing or the anxiety of what might not come. And it is precisely that neutrality that makes it the point of greatest creative potential. Think of how a neutral magnetic field functions. It isn't absent of force. It's an equilibrium of forces. And it is in that equilibrium that a new orientation can be introduced with the least possible resistance. An intention placed into a neutral internal field meets minimum interference. Not because reality became simpler, but because the creator stopped being the greatest obstacle to what they want to create. The science of the 0 point, as Daniel understands it, is essentially this: learning to identify when you are operating from the noise of identity, and developing the capacity to return to the neutral field not as emergency technique but as baseline posture. It isn't permanent illumination. It isn't eternal absence of conflict. It's the ability to recognize noise when it arises, to distinguish between a thought and identification with the thought, between feeling something and becoming that something, and to return, without drama, to the substrate that precedes identification. That is practicable. It isn't easy at first because the mind is accustomed to identifying with its own content. It confuses having an anxious thought with being an anxious person. It confuses feeling urgency with being someone in an urgent situation. And that confusion, that fusion between the observer and the observed content, is the structural root of nearly all the internal incoherence people experience. The moment you realize you can observe a thought without being the thought, that you can feel urgency without becoming urgency, is the moment the 0 point space begins to become accessible not as accident but as territory. And territory can be explored, can be inhabited. It can become, over time, the place from which you operate by default, rather than the place you visit accidentally in the gaps between efforts. That is the shift Daniel calls the change of operating point. And it is the most consequential difference that exists between those who create from noise and those who create from coherence. Creating from noise produces results, sometimes large results. But they arrive at the cost of the effort that generated them, they carry the signature of the tension that produced them, and they frequently need to be maintained at the same level of effort that created them. It's like filling a bucket with a hole. You can fill it, but you can never stop filling it. Creating from coherence produces results that sustain themselves. Not because you worked more, but because what was created doesn't carry the original incoherence that normally generates the cycle of achievement and loss, of arrival and return to the starting point. What emerges from a coherent internal field tends to integrate coherently into reality, not as exception but as natural extension of who you are. And who you are, operating from the 0 point, is nobody special. It's someone who stopped being the thing that was in the way, who let go of the contracted identity that was creating resistance, who became temporarily nobody and discovered that nobody is the point from which everything can emerge. Become nobody to have everything. It's not a slogan. It's mechanics. Nobody is not an absence of value. It's the absence of contracted agenda. It's the mind before the inventory of lacks. This consciousness before being mobilized by urgency. And from that point, clean, oriented but not tense, present but not grasping. What moves does so with a fluidity that effort never reaches. Because effort always carries with it the question, will it work? And that question is, structurally, the affirmation that it might not. And the field responds to the affirmation. The 0 point doesn't carry that question. Not because it denies uncertainty, but because it isn't operating from the fear of uncertainty. It's operating from something more fundamental, the coherence of what is, in this moment, without the weight of what may or may not come. And it is from that point, only from that point, that creation happens without resistance. Not without work. Without resistance. The distinction is absolute. Work is oriented action. Resistance is internal conflict. You can work with great intensity from the 0 point, and the intensity of that work creates no incoherence, because it isn't loaded with anxiety about the result. It's simply in service of a clear direction. And clear direction, without anxiety about outcomes, is the most precise combination that exists for coherent creation. Daniel spent years dismantling the layers that prevented people from accessing this state. Not as therapist, not as guru, but as investigator. And what he found, repeatedly, was not a lack of capacity. It was an excess of loaded identity. An excess of story about who they are, what they deserve, what they can expect, what is realistic, what is possible for someone like them. All of that story, useful in many contexts, becomes, in the field of creation, noise, because it orients the system from the past. And the past, by definition, is the configuration that already existed. If you create from the configuration that already existed, you create more of what already existed. That is the cycle. That is the hole in the bucket. The 0 point doesn't operate from the past. It operates from the present without history. And the present without history is potentially anything. Not anything in the magical sense. Anything in the structural sense. When the internal system is not preconfigured by the identity of the past, it can organize itself according to new configurations. It can respond to intentions that didn't exist before. It can create trajectories that the old identity would have judged improbable. Not because it breaks laws, but because it operates according to laws that the contracted identity never accessed. That is what Daniel calls perception engineering, the deliberate modification of the operating point of consciousness, not through willpower, not through visualization techniques, not through repeated affirmation, but through the gradual and lucid dismantling of the identity structures that create the noise that prevents coherence. It is quiet work, not dramatic, not glorious, sometimes tedious, but it's the only work that, once done, doesn't need to be redone, because it doesn't add a new layer on top of the old ones. It removes what is blocking, and what remains, the substrate, the field, the presence that preceded the I, doesn't need to be built, only revealed. The null state emerged from the need to go beyond traditional manifestation techniques. It was created to help you understand and sustain that internal point of neutrality where effort disappears and reality begins to respond coherently. More than learning something new, it's a process of dismantling the identity that forces, allowing change to happen through alignment rather than tension. It isn't mandatory. It's for those who feel it makes sense, For those who have already realized that techniques aren't what's missing, but that something more fundamental still needs to be understood. If this resonates, the link to go deeper is in the pinned comment. Daniel closes with the observation that started all of this. The mechanism was never hidden. It was being covered by the intensity of effort, by the density of identity, by the constant noise of whoever monitors, controls, tries, revises, starts over. And when that noise, through exhaustion, through investigation, through an accidental moment of quiet in front of a kitchen wall on a Tuesday afternoon, finally falls silent, what was always there becomes visible. Not as conquest, as recognition. Write in the comments your name and a single word that describes what you felt while listening to this. Could be silence, could be neutrality, could be coherence, could be something only you know how to name.